What if I told you that while the world celebrated my genius, I was secretly writing notes to myself, admitting I didn't know what I was doing? What if the private journals I kept, the scraps of paper I scribbled on late at night, the notebooks I never intended anyone to see, revealed a man drowning in self-doubt, struggling with depression, and questioning whether any of this meant anything? And what if these notes, discovered decades after my death, showed a side of Einstein that no biography mentions, no documentary explores, and no one wants to acknowledge? Stay with me, because what I'm about to share will shatter every assumption you have about genius, about confidence, about what it actually feels like to be the person everyone thinks has all the answers. Because the truth is, I spent most of my life feeling lost, and these private notes prove it. My name is Albert Einstein, and I kept secrets. Not scandalous secrets, not affairs hidden from my wife, though there were those too, but deeper secrets, the kind you keep from yourself, the kind you only admit on paper late at night when no one is watching and you're too exhausted to maintain the performance anymore. I kept notebooks, dozens of them. Some were for physics, yes, equations and calculations and diagrams, but others were different, personal, confessional, streams of consciousness where I tried to understand myself, my feelings, my fears, where I asked questions I could never ask out loud, where I admitted things that would have destroyed the carefully constructed image of Einstein, the confident genius. These notebooks were found after I died, scattered among my papers, some in my desk, some hidden away. And scholars who have read them, really read them, they're shocked because they reveal a man nothing like the public Einstein. They reveal someone fragile, uncertain, often paralyzed by self-doubt, someone who questioned not just his theories, but his entire existence. And that's what I want to share with you today. Not the sanitized version, not the myth, but the real private notes, the thoughts I only trusted to paper, the side of me no one talks about. Let me start with the depression, because that's the elephant in the room that everyone ignores. I struggled with depression throughout my life, periods where I couldn't work, couldn't think, could barely get out of bed, where everything felt pointless and heavy and dark. And in my private notes, I documented this, tried to understand it, tried to find my way through it. In a note from 1913 I wrote, "I feel like I'm drowning in a sea of meaninglessness. The equations, the theories, what are they for? Who cares? In 100 years, in 1,000 years, the sun will burn out and none of this will have mattered. And knowing that, how do I motivate myself to continue? How does anyone? This is not the voice of confident genius. This is someone in existential crisis, someone questioning the point of everything. And this wasn't an isolated moment. My notes are filled with passages like this, dark reflections, questions about meaning, about purpose, about whether any human endeavor matters in the face of cosmic indifference." In another note from the 1920s, I wrote, "I woke up this morning and couldn't remember why I should care about anything. The unified field theory, what difference does it make? If I solve it or don't solve it, the universe continues exactly the same. I am an insignificant speck trying to understand an indifferent cosmos. And for what? For recognition? For the satisfaction of knowing? But recognition fades, and satisfaction is temporary, and in the end I'll die and be forgotten like everyone else." Read that again. I'll die and be forgotten like everyone else. This from the man who would become one of the most famous people in history. But I didn't know that when I wrote it. And even after I became famous, the feeling didn't go away. The depression, the sense of meaninglessness, the weight of existence. Fame didn't cure it. If anything, fame made it worse, because now I had to perform, had to be Einstein, had to maintain this image of someone who had it all figured out, when inside
I was still that drowning man, still questioning everything, still wondering what the point was. And here's what no one tells you about depression. It doesn't care about your accomplishments. It doesn't care that you revolutionized physics, that you're celebrated worldwide, that you have everything society says you should want. Depression doesn't care. It finds you anyway. It whispers that none of it matters, that you're still empty inside, that the applause and awards are just noise covering up the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. And I had no tools to fight it, no therapy, no medication, no understanding that this was a medical condition, not a philosophical insight. I thought I was seeing clearly, seeing through the illusions that kept other people going, seeing the truth that life has no inherent meaning and that all our striving is ultimately futile. I thought this made me wise, deeper than others, more honest, but it was just depression, lying to me, distorting everything, making me believe that the darkness was truth and the light was delusion. In my private notes, I tried to reason my way out of it, tried to construct philosophical arguments for why life mattered despite the apparent meaninglessness. In one note I wrote, "Perhaps meaning is not something we discover, but something we create. Perhaps the universe is indifferent, but our connections to each other are not. Perhaps love and curiosity and beauty are meaning enough, even if they don't last forever." This was me trying to save myself, trying to find a reason to keep going. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes I could pull myself out of the darkness, could rediscover enthusiasm for my work, could feel, briefly, that what I was doing mattered. But other times it didn't work. Other times the darkness won, and I would write things like, "I see no way out. The more clearly I think, the more obvious it becomes that everything is futile. Consciousness is a curse, awareness is suffering, and I cannot turn it off, cannot unsee what I've seen, cannot unfeel what I feel." These notes terrify me now, looking back, because I was so close to the edge, so close to giving up entirely, and no one knew. No one could see it, because I hid it so well, performed so convincingly, smiled for the cameras, and gave wise speeches, and acted like everything was fine, while inside I was falling apart.
Let me tell you about another aspect of my private notes that shocks people. My admissions of intellectual inadequacy, of feeling stupid, of being convinced I was a fraud who would eventually be exposed. This is what psychologists now call impostor syndrome, and I had it severely. In a note from 1908, when I was still working at the patent office, I wrote, "I read the papers of other physicists, and I'm convinced they're all smarter than me. They understand things I don't, see connections I miss, and one day everyone will realize I've just been lucky, that I stumbled onto relativity by accident, that I'm not actually brilliant, just good at faking it." This was before I was famous, before anyone knew my name, but the feeling persisted even after I achieved recognition. In a note from 1920, after I had won the Nobel Prize, I wrote, "They gave me the prize for the photoelectric effect, not for relativity. Why? Because they're not sure relativity is right. They're hedging their bets, and maybe they're correct to doubt. Maybe I've convinced everyone of something that's actually wrong. Maybe in 10 years someone will find the flaw, and I'll be remembered as the man who led physics astray." This is paranoia, irrational fear, but it felt real to me. It felt like honest assessment. I was convinced that I didn't deserve the recognition I was getting, that I was somehow tricking people, that eventually the truth would come out and I would be humiliated.
And in my private notes, I documented this fear, examined it, tried to talk myself out of it, but also sometimes surrendered to it, accepted that maybe I really was a fraud, maybe I really didn't belong among the great minds, maybe it was all just luck and timing and the willingness to make bold claims that happened to be right. I wrote pages trying to understand where this feeling came from, and I traced it back to my childhood, to being a late talker, to struggling in school, to teachers who told me I would never amount to anything, to my father's business failures and the family's financial struggles, to feeling like I was always on the outside, always the odd one, the one who didn't fit. And even after I succeeded, even after I proved everyone wrong, I still felt like that outsider, still felt like I didn't deserve to be here, still felt like someone would eventually expose me as the fraud I believed myself to be. Now, decades later, psychologists read these notes and they recognize the pattern, classic impostor syndrome, common among high achievers. The better you do, the more you feel like you're faking it. The more success you have, the more you fear being exposed. It's irrational, but it's real, and I lived with it my entire life. And reading about this, about the fact that what I experienced has a name, that other people feel this way, that it's a known psychological phenomenon, it makes me wish I had known that then, wish I had understood that the voice telling me I was a fraud was lying, that it was a cognitive distortion, not reality, that I could have fought it instead of believing it. But I didn't know, so I suffered, alone, in silence, documenting it in notes I never showed anyone, because admitting it would have confirmed what I feared, that I didn't belong, that I was weak, that I wasn't the genius everyone thought I was.
Let me tell you about another theme in my private notes: loneliness, profound, crushing loneliness. Despite being surrounded by people, despite having colleagues and friends and family, I felt isolated, disconnected, like no one really knew me, like no one could understand what I was experiencing. In a note from 1935, I wrote, "I am alone, not physically, but essentially. I am trapped inside my own consciousness with no way to truly communicate what I think and feel. I can write equations, I can give lectures, but I cannot make anyone understand what it's like to be me. And so I am alone, forever alone, no matter how many people surround me." This is the isolation of consciousness, the recognition that we are all fundamentally alone inside our own heads, that we can never truly merge with another person, never fully know them or be known by them. And for me, this wasn't just philosophy, it was lived experience, a source of profound pain. I craved connection, real connection, not the surface-level interactions of academic conferences or dinner parties, but deep, genuine understanding, someone who could see me, really see me, not Einstein the genius, but me, the scared, confused, lonely man beneath the image. And I never found that. Or maybe I found it briefly and lost it, or pushed it away, or didn't recognize it when it was there. My notes are full of lament about this, about the impossibility of real connection, about the tragedy of being conscious and aware and unable to bridge the gap between myself and others. In one particularly painful note, I wrote, "Mileva once understood me, or I thought she did. When we were young and in love and discussing physics together, I felt seen, known. But that was an illusion, or it faded, or I destroyed it. And now, even when I'm with people, I'm performing, playing the role, and no one sees past it. No one asks what I'm actually feeling, what I'm actually struggling with. They just want Einstein, the symbol, the genius, and I give them that, because it's easier than admitting I'm lost." This breaks my heart, reading it now, seeing how desperately I wanted to be known,
how isolated I felt despite the fame, despite the recognition, despite everything, because none of that touches the core loneliness, the existential isolation, and I didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to let people in, didn't know how to be vulnerable in a way that created real connection. So I stayed behind the wall, alone, documenting my loneliness in notes no one would read until I was dead. And this is something no biography talks about, no documentary explores, because it's uncomfortable, because it contradicts the narrative, because Einstein, the lonely depressive, doesn't sell. Einstein, the confident genius, sells. So that's the story that gets told. And the private notes, the evidence of my pain, that gets downplayed, mentioned briefly if at all, treated as a footnote rather than a central part of who I was.
Let me share something else from my private notes. My struggle with the concept of God, with religion, with spirituality. Publicly, I gave carefully crafted answers about cosmic religious feeling, about being in awe of the universe's order, about not believing in a personal God, but believing in something transcendent. And those statements were true as far as they went, but they were incomplete. They were the polished version. In my private notes, I was messier, more uncertain, more conflicted. In one note, I wrote, I want to believe in something, in some meaning beyond the material, in some purpose beyond survival and reproduction, but I can't. I look at the universe and I see patterns, mathematics, physics, but I don't see purpose, don't see intention, don't see God. And this fills me with despair. Because if there's no God, no ultimate meaning, then what am I? Just a pattern of atoms that happens to be self-aware? Just a cosmic accident? And that thought is unbearable. This is not cosmic religious feeling. This is existential despair. This is someone desperately wanting to believe in something, but unable to convince himself. And I wrestled with this constantly, went back and forth. In some notes, I would argue myself into a kind of faith, a belief that the universe's mathematical beauty implied some kind of transcendent order, some purpose. But then in other notes, I would tear that argument apart, would recognize it as wishful thinking, would admit that I was projecting meaning onto a meaningless cosmos because I couldn't handle the alternative. In another note, I wrote, religion is a crutch, I see that clearly, a way for humans to avoid facing the void, the meaninglessness, the indifference of the universe. And I judge religious people for needing that crutch, for being weak. But what if I'm the weak one? What if refusing to believe doesn't make me brave or honest? What if it just makes me unable to find comfort, unable to feel at peace? What if my skepticism is its own kind of prison? These notes reveal someone in spiritual crisis, someone who wanted faith but couldn't achieve it, who envied believers their certainty but couldn't share it, who was too intellectually honest to accept comforting lies but too emotionally fragile to thrive without them. And this tension, this conflict, it never resolved. I died without resolving it, without finding peace. And that's reflected in my final notes. In the last months of my life, I wrote, I'm about to find out if there's anything beyond death, or if this is it, the end, the cessation of consciousness, the return to non-being. And I'm terrified, not of judgment, not of hell, but of nothingness, of the erasure of everything I am. And also, secretly, I'm hoping I'm wrong, hoping there's something, not heaven, not God, but something, some continuation, some surprise, some revelation that all of this meant something after all. That vulnerability, that admission of hope despite skepticism, that's not something I ever said publicly.
It's only in these private notes, only in the thoughts I shared with no one, and it reveals a side of me that contradicts everything people think they know. Einstein, the rational scientist, Einstein who had transcended childish hopes of an afterlife, that wasn't me, or not fully me. I was more complicated than that, more human, more afraid.
Now let me tell you about what might be the most surprising theme in my private notes: my hatred of being famous, my resentment of the attention, my wish to disappear. People assume that fame must be wonderful, that being celebrated, recognized, admired, that must be gratifying. And in some ways it was. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There was satisfaction in knowing my work was valued, in having influence, in being able to speak and have people listen. But the cost was enormous, and in my private notes I documented that cost. In a note from 1922, shortly after winning the Nobel Prize, I wrote, "I can't go anywhere without being recognized, can't have a private moment, can't think without people wanting to know what I'm thinking. I've become public property, a thing people feel entitled to, and I hate it. I hate the attention, the intrusion, the constant performance. I just want to be left alone, to think, to exist without being Einstein." This feeling intensified over the years. The more famous I became, the more trapped I felt. The more the public Einstein diverged from the private me, the more exhausting it became to maintain the performance. In a note from the 1930s, I wrote, "I've created a monster, Einstein, this character I play, this wise, eccentric genius, and now I'm stuck with it. I can't escape it, can't be anyone else. People are disappointed when I don't live up to the image, when I'm just tired or grumpy or don't have a clever quote. They want Einstein, not me. And sometimes I forget which is which. Sometimes I lose myself in the character, and that's terrifying. What if I've erased myself? What if there's no me left, just the performance? This is a specific kind of hell, the prison of fame, of public expectation, and I had no way out. I couldn't just quit being Einstein, couldn't disappear, couldn't reclaim my privacy. Once you're famous forever, or at least for the rest of your life. And every moment in public is performance. Every conversation is with someone who has preconceptions, who wants something from you, who sees the symbol, not the person. And in my notes I mourned this loss, mourned the privacy I once had, the anonymity, the freedom to be no one special, just Albert, just a man thinking about physics because he found it interesting, not Einstein, not the genius, not the symbol, just me. Let me share another aspect of my private notes that scholars find disturbing, my misanthropy, my growing contempt for humanity. I'm known as a humanitarian, as someone who cared about peace, about justice, about human welfare, and I did care. Publicly, I advocated for all of those things, but privately, in my notes, I expressed a very different view, a darker view. In a note from 1940, during World War II, I wrote, "Humans are a disease, a violent, destructive, irrational disease that infects the planet. We create art and music and mathematics, yes, but we also create war and genocide and suffering on a scale no other species can match. And I'm supposed to care about this species, supposed to work for its betterment? Sometimes I think the universe would be better off without us." This is not the voice of a humanitarian. This is someone who has lost faith in humanity, who has seen too much cruelty, too much stupidity, too much evil, and who is exhausted by it.
In another note I wrote, "I look at people and I see children,
Frightened children lashing out, clinging to tribalism and nationalism and religion because they're too scared to face reality. And I'm supposed to respect this? Supposed to pretend their beliefs deserve consideration? I can't. I'm tired of pretending, tired of being diplomatic. Most people are fools, and the world is run by the biggest fools of all, and nothing I do will change that. This is bitter, angry, contemptuous, and it's not how I spoke publicly. Publicly, I was measured, hopeful, encouraging. I talked about humanity's potential, about the possibility of progress, about the importance of education and reason. But privately, I didn't believe it, or I was losing faith. The gap between my public statements and private feelings was enormous, and maintaining that gap, performing optimism I didn't feel, that was exhausting. In my notes, I let myself be honest, let myself express the darkness, the contempt, the misanthropy I couldn't voice publicly without destroying my influence. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something, because I'm curious about your reaction to all of this. Now that you know that Einstein, the symbol of genius and wisdom, was actually depressed, insecure, lonely, conflicted about God, resentful of fame, and sometimes contemptuous of humanity, does that change how you see me? Does it diminish my work? Does it make the theories less valuable? Or does it make me more human, more relatable, more real? I'm genuinely interested in your perspective, because this is the question that scholars and biographers have wrestled with. Do we show the full person, flaws and darkness included, or do we protect the legacy by emphasizing the positive and downplaying the negative? And I think the answer matters, not just for how I'm remembered, but for how we think about genius, about achievement, about what we expect from people who accomplish extraordinary things. So, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Does knowing about my private struggles make you respect me more or less? Does it change anything? Or is it just context that doesn't affect the value of the work itself? Let me tell you about one more theme in my private notes, my fear of madness, of losing my mind. This was a constant background fear that intensified as I got older. My second son, Edward, developed schizophrenia, and I was terrified I would follow the same path, that my mind, my only real asset, would betray me, would turn against itself, would trap me in delusion or chaos. In a note from 1948, I wrote, "I felt confused today, couldn't hold a thought, couldn't follow my own reasoning, and I panicked. Is this it? Is this the beginning of dementia, of losing myself? I would rather die than lose my mind, would rather cease to exist than exist without the ability to think clearly." This fear was not rational. Mental illness ran in my family. Edward's condition haunted me, and I knew that aging often brought cognitive decline, and for someone whose identity was so wrapped up in intellectual capacity, the prospect of losing that capacity was worse than death.
In another note from my final years, I wrote, "I'm forgetting things, small things, names, dates, where I put something. And I tell myself it's normal aging. Everyone forgets things. But what if it's not normal? What if it's the start of something worse? And how would I know? Would I notice myself declining? Or would I slip into confusion without realizing it? Would I become a shell of myself while still believing I was fine? This terror of losing control, of losing myself, it's palpable in these notes. And it adds a tragic dimension to my final years, because even as I was trying to finish my work on the unified field theory, even as I was writing and thinking and trying to contribute, I was haunted by the fear that my mind was failing, that I was grasping at problems I could no longer solve, that I was fooling myself about my own capacity. And that fear, that self-doubt, it's never mentioned in the biographies. It's hidden in these private notes, these admissions I made to myself, these fears I couldn't share with anyone. Let me tell you why these notes matter, why they're important, despite being uncomfortable, despite revealing a side of me that contradicts the legend. First, because they're true. They're the unfiltered reality, and truth matters. If we're going to understand genius, understand what it actually means to be someone who achieves extraordinary things, we need the full picture. Not just the highlights, not just the triumphs, but also the struggles, the doubts, the darkness. Because genius doesn't happen in spite of being human. It happens as part of being human, with all the complexity and contradiction that entails. Second, because these notes are helpful to people who struggle with depression, with impostor syndrome, with loneliness, with existential despair. Seeing that even Einstein felt these things, seeing that even the most celebrated mind of the 20th century was plagued by self-doubt and meaninglessness, that's validating, that's comforting in a strange way. It says, you're not weak for feeling this way, you're not broken, you're human, and even extraordinary people feel human. Third, because these notes are a warning about the cost of achievement, about what happens when you sacrifice everything for your work, about the importance of balance, of connection, of taking care of your mental health. My private notes document what happens when you don't do those things, when you push through depression instead of treating it, when you isolate instead of connecting, when you perform instead of being authentic. And the result is suffering, is loneliness, is a life that looks successful from the outside, but feels empty from the inside. That's the warning. That's what these notes teach. And maybe, if you're reading this, if you're someone who's ambitious or driven or convinced that achieving something great requires sacrificing everything else, maybe these notes will make you reconsider. Maybe they'll make you prioritize differently. Maybe they'll save you from my mistakes.
And fourth, because these notes are ultimately humanizing. They take Einstein the symbol and turn him back into Einstein the person. And that matters, because symbols are distant, untouchable, impossible to relate to. But people are close. People make mistakes. People struggle. And if I'm a person, if I'm human like you, then maybe what I achieved is more accessible. Maybe you don't need to be a flawless genius to contribute something meaningful. Maybe you can be depressed and insecure and confused and still do good work. Maybe being fully human with all your flaws and fears is not disqualifying. Maybe it's actually necessary. Maybe the depth of thought comes from the depth of struggle. Maybe the insights come from wrestling with meaning. Maybe you can't understand the universe without first wrestling with yourself. That's what my private notes suggest. That's the pattern they reveal. And that's why they matter. Let me tell you about the last private note I wrote. It was April of 1955, just days before I died. I knew I didn't have much time left. My body was failing. And I wrote this. I'm about to disappear, to become nothing. And I realize now that all my efforts to understand the universe were really efforts to understand myself, to find meaning, to prove I mattered. And did I succeed? I don't know. The equations will outlast me, but will they matter? In 100 years? In 1,000? Or will they just be curiosities, historical footnotes? I wanted to touch eternity, to create something permanent, but nothing is permanent. Everything fades. Even stars die. Even universes end. So what was the point? What did any of this mean? I don't have an answer. I'm dying without an answer. And maybe that's the human condition, to ask questions that have no answers, to seek meaning that doesn't exist,
to create significance in the face of insignificance. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the asking is the answer. Maybe the creating is the meaning. I don't know. I'm too tired to know. But I tried. I asked. I created. I lived. And now I'll die. And that will have to be enough. That's how it ended, with uncertainty, with unresolved questions, with acceptance mixed with despair. And that note, that final private thought, it's the most honest thing I ever wrote. It's me, stripped of pretense, facing the void, not with courage or wisdom, but with simple human fear and confusion. And that's real. That's authentic. That's the truth these private notes contain. Not the legend, not the myth, but the man. Flawed, frightened, brilliant, broken. All of it, all at once. And maybe that's the real genius. Not the physics, but the honesty, the willingness to wrestle with the hardest questions, to document the struggle, to leave evidence of what it's like to be conscious, to be aware, to be human. That's what these notes are. Evidence, testimony, truth. And they deserve to be seen, deserve to be understood, deserve to be part of how I'm remembered. Not instead of the physics, but alongside it. The complete picture, the whole truth, the side of Einstein no one talks about, until now. Hit subscribe to discover more hidden truths about history's greatest minds.